Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on inclusive education for Inclusive Education Month. Uh, Today will be a conversation between Gordon Porter and Anna McQuarrie. We want to begin by acknowledging that we are virtually gathering on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. To uphold our duties and responsibilities as treaty people, we commit to a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration in our shared journey towards healing and understanding. We'd also like to recognize that Nova Scotia is home to over 50 African Nova Scotian communities whose culture, heritage, and histories have been and remain a key part of this province for more than 400 years. For generations, African Nova Scotians have experienced inequities due to systemic racism across Nova Scotia and still do today. Inclusion Nova Scotia is committed to learning and growing as an organization. We are committed to taking actionable steps towards addressing systemic discrimination as we advocate for equity and inclusion and recognizing intersectionality in the work that we do.
I'm really excited to introduce the work that we do here at Inclusion Nova Scotia for those who have not been connected to us in the past. So before we go to our speakers, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the exciting things we have going on. Inclusion Nova Scotia is a provincial nonprofit association committed to empowering people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, enabling them to live full and inclusive lives. We were founded by families to support families in becoming strong advocates for their loved ones. Along with providing webinars like today, we support families by working with them directly with one-on-one to vision, plan, and advocate for an inclusive life and community. And we know that often starts with school. This is our incredible team here at Inclusion Nova Scotia, the placemakers who work with families directly. After today, please reach out to our team with any questions you have, the support you'd like with visioning, navigating, and advocating. You'll see our amazing team on this screen, and we are continuing to grow. We have some representation all over the province, both in Cape Breton and Western and here in Central, and we hope to reach new corners of the province very soon. Please stay connected to see what we have going on our social media and sign up for our newsletter. We wholeheartedly believe that there is power in coming together to learn from one another and imagine what is possible, and that there is power in coming together to advocate for a more inclusive future. Here are some other exciting events that we have going on that we hope that you will join us for as well. On March 4th, we have a virtual gathering grow between 6 and 8 p.m. and it's an opportunity for families to come and connect. Usually done in person, this is a virtual option for families across the province to delve into topics that resonate and foster a sense of community while promoting a mindset of inclusion. If you're interested, please reach out to Chelsea at Cape Breton CV at inclusionns.ca. From May 7th to 9th, there's the Social Role Valorization Conference, and that's being held here in Halifax. It's a global gathering bringing together advocates, professionals, and families to explore how fostering those valued social roles can lead to greater inclusion and meaningful lives for people with disabilities and their families. On May 23rd to 24th, we are really excited to be hosting a family leadership weekend as part of a commitment to increase capacity and knowledge to support families in their desire for meaningful and inclusive life. Parents and leaders from Inclusion Canada will join us to share proven strategies and stories on supporting their loved ones with an intellectual disability and the normative pathways of life, capitalizing on the capacity of the community to be truly inclusive and naturally supportive. Through stories they will share of inclusion and connections, and we hope families will learn how to successfully navigate an inclusive life with their loved one. We don't have registration officially open yet, but if you're interested, please send me an email at family@inclusionns.ca. Like I said, we're all about continuing the conversation and staying connected. So we hope for those of you who are attending today, you'll join us again next week, next Wednesday, with Chelsea, our placemaker, to talk about what you've learned today. What are some of the aha moments you had? What are some tips and tricks and strategies that you'll be taking away? And just to connect with other families across the province. After after Gordon and Anna both have an opportunity to speak, we will be opening up the questions. And I just want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A button at the bottom in your toolbar. And also to enable closed captioning, please click on the CC Live transcript and select Show Subtitle. I'd now like to turn it over to Inclusion Nova Scotia's Executive Director, Vivian, who will be moderating today's discussion. But first, and then we're going to end with a very exciting announcement.
Thanks, Jana. Thank you so much. So as everyone knows, February is Inclusive Education Month. It's really a time to recognize the importance of welcoming and supporting, valuing all learners in schools. And we are fortunate today to have this conversation and an opportunity to discuss with a parent in Anna and as well as Gordon about the importance of this can bring. Inclusive education isn't just about academics, really about fostering belonging, independence, and opportunities for all students to thrive among their peers. Being included in classroom with your peers is a foundation to ensuring an inclusive life and community and a sense of belonging. And school is often the first place children experience community, relationship, and social belonging. And it's more than academics. It's really about those friendships and that social growth opportunities that we all have the opportunity to have in schools. So without further ado, I am, if I can get Anna and Gordon to turn on the cameras, maybe. So we are excited to have Gordon Porter and Anna McCory, who will share their insights and experience on inclusive education. For those who may not know, Gordon, who is out in space right now, as you can see, is the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, a member of the Order of New Brunswick and an Order of Canada, and a past president of Inclusion Canada, with more than 35 years of experience in inclusive education, ranging from principal, school district administrator, educator, senior policy advisor, and consultant in developing inclusive education worldwide. He's a former chair of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission and the president of the Canadian Association of Human Rights Agency. In here in Nova Scotia, Gordon actually played a significant role in the constitutional challenge on the right of education in 1987, supporting Luke Elwood and his family in the landmark case with the Supreme Court, fighting for the right for Luke to attend classes in his neighborhood school. Anna McCory, for those who don't know, is a dedicated advocate and parent. She has worked in the disability rights movement for almost 2 decades with Inclusion Nova Scotia, Inclusion Canada, and Inclusion International. She has been involved in several transformative changes, including the Human Rights Remedy and the development of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So I'd like to welcome both. And thank you both for taking the time to share. So I'm going to start with Gordon, and hopefully, Jana, you can just spotlight him when I go to it right now. So Gordon, really, I mean, I'll open the floor to kind of talk about the core principles of inclusive education and how you feel would be guiding in the effective implementation.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Yeah, I've been working on trying to make schools inclusive for longer than I want to admit now, a long time. And I think that the critical component of making a switch from traditional thinking about special education to inclusive education is that we accept that what children do and learn from each other when they're together is more significant long-term than if they have special education instruction, even with someone considered a, quote, specialist. The social and the equity that comes from being part of a group in your community school, growing up, living with the other children who you attend school with day after day, from kindergarten to grade 12, 5 days a week, 39 to 40 weeks a year, year after year after year, the cumulative effect of what it means for children to do that, to be included, to belong, to participate, even if their academic learning isn't exactly the same, is a powerful, powerful thing. And often when I talk about inclusive education, I'll ask people to, without a preliminary, as I've just done, ask them who they think within any system are the most critical people to make inclusion work. And many times people will say, well, it's the teacher, or it's the school principal, or it's the political leaders who set the policies. And my answer is the critical players in making inclusion work are the other children. And I think we have to value that and put a premium on the time that children spend with each other in their community school, in regular classrooms. Now, on a simple, inclusion's simple in some ways. It simply means you go to the same school as your siblings, if you're basically the same age, if it's elementary school. You're placed in a class with your age mates, as everyone is in schools in Canada, and that your teacher takes responsibility for your learning and your participation. And people work hard, the collaboration between family and teachers to make that successful. It's a simple concept. Children are in families, families are in communities, communities are served by schools. But we've made it very complicated. Certainly, teachers need support. Teachers need a number of things to make them able to be successful day by day. They need good teaching practices that we hope universities, teacher training provides to them. They need collaboration when they're in the school. They need leadership from their school leaders. They need paraprofessional support in some cases. They need ongoing, continuous learning to deal with the unique challenges presented by each individual child. And I think where we are now in Canada in terms of inclusive education is solidifying the fact that if inclusion is going to work, teachers have to be given support when they need it, the kind of support that makes a difference, and it has to be delivered by people with experience and competence so that they can figure out strategies that'll make things go well for the students in their class. And in my work across Canada, I'd say the single greatest obstacle is that leaders have not seen that with inclusion, the support is being provided to classroom teachers. Too many of the resource people who could be helping are spending time in small group instruction with students in learning centers or in resource rooms. Too many teachers are left to figure out how to deal with children when they're in their class by themselves. And the challenge of making inclusion work really requires teamwork, collaboration, and grounded practical support to solve the problems that will inevitably arise. Those are the key things that I think make a difference. A mindset that inclusion matters, that during the course of a child's school life, it makes a difference, and making sure the teachers who have to carry that out are given the kind of training and support they need to do it effectively.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Gordon. And that actually leads perfectly. Anna, if you want to share some of your personal experiences with small groups and segregated classrooms and some of the struggles you've had with trying to advocate for inclusive education.
Sorry, I still have to remember to unmute myself. So thank you. I'm going to start with a small disclaimer that I am in a sweatshirt and very unprepared in the sense of I've been at the emergency vet with my dog since about 3 o'clock this afternoon. So I apologize for not being a little bit more pulled together and being a bit scattered. I'm also in someone's office and the lights just turned off on me a few minutes ago. So if it goes dark, I haven't left you. I just haven't figured out my space yet. So bear with me. But I'm really excited to be here. And I have to say, I've had the pleasure of hearing Gordon speak a number of times. And every time I hear Gordon talk, it really resonates about why inclusion matters and what it is for us families to push that forward. So as Vivian mentioned, my name is Anna McQuarrie. I come to these discussions with many hats. For over 20 years, I've worked in the disability community. As Vivian mentioned, I worked nationally for Inclusion Canada. I've worked internationally for Inclusion International, and I've done some work more locally with Inclusion Nova Scotia. And my focus has always been on people with intellectual disabilities and their families. As Vivian mentioned, I had a really great privilege of being part of the negotiations and development of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then spent most of my work working around the world with families on how do we make this real in people's communities and in people's lives. Now, the irony of those experiences is that I had to quit my paid human rights work to stay home and do my human rights work. And what I mean by that is I'm a parent. I have 3 kiddos with disabilities, and keeping them in inclusive school scenarios has been my full-time job. When we were getting kids settled into school, I had a naive level of confidence that I had the skills and resources to navigate the common challenges I'd heard about through my paid work about the challenges families faced in accessing inclusive education. After all, I knew the convention, I had access. Oh, there we go, dark again. Sorry about that. 1 second. I am back. Someone's going to teach me how to fix that. Thank you, Gianna. So I knew about the convention. I had access to progressive, inclusive education practices that I could share with my school and our teachers. And when things went sideways, I could call people like Gordon Porter or Diane Richler. I had extreme privilege to be able to access great resources from around the world. Through my work and through Gordon's teachings and other people, I really learned the importance of inclusive education. I knew, as Gordon has mentioned here, that kids who are included in school are more likely to have jobs. They are less likely to live in poverty. They have improved health outcomes and are more likely to have peers outside of their immediate family. And that while generally across the disability community, we know there's no one magic solution, inclusive education is pretty close to being that defining element that really impacts across your lifespan, building an inclusive life. So I have 3 kids with disabilities, and their experiences in inclusive education have been as different as they are from each other. We've had remarkable successes and achievements, and we've had devastating loss and fights. Through it all, it's required hypervigilance, required knowing when to pick my battles and when to scorch the earth beneath us. And time again, it has been soul destroying for us as a family and for me as the mom who's doing most of the advocating. Gordon had mentioned the sort of importance of vision for inclusion. And for me, my knowledge about the power of inclusive education and that strength of my vision has always been my guiding light. I knew that when inclusive education wasn't working, it wasn't me. I knew it wasn't the teacher, it wasn't the EPA, it was the system. Inclusive education wasn't the problem in the challenges I was having. It's that what we are getting offered often is not inclusive education. And the truth is, what we have found in our family experience is that our systems are really broken. Education is underfunded. Inclusion continues to be seen as an extra or an add-on, or it's something we need to ask our teachers to support our kids as though we don't deserve that or as though it's not a right. Inclusion is seen as the responsibility of someone else. And we know time and again in our conversations with schools or teachers or principals that it's really still misunderstood about what authentic inclusive education means and what it looks like. So we continue to see, as Gordon mentioned, models that rely heavily on EPAs, on grouping people together based on their differences, as opposed to helping people be included in ways that they authentically want. We struggle with things like course selection and have had multiple conversations with our high school that course selection is not determined by EPA availability. Course selection needs to be determined by what my kid wants to do and how it's going to further her life and her academic opportunities. So no surprise, this has been a challenge for us. And I know that when my kids don't get the support they need and don't feel like they belong, they're going to respond in the only way that they know how, and that's through their behavior. That's their way of communicating when things are going badly. So it's no surprise that every incident we've ever had at school can be traced back to a deviation from the support plan, an unexpected change or an event that was unexpected, or something contributing to that feeling that they don't belong. To be honest, I really thought I was going to rock this inclusive education thing. I knew all the strategies, and the strategies are the right things. I think what I've struggled with as a parent is realizing the strategies require a two-way street, and that sometimes can be a bit tricky. So I really prioritize building a relationship with our schools and extending my husband and I as partners. We are there to work with teachers, work with schools to help be successful. And that's a strategy I think has made a really big difference. And when it works well, it works really well. And the system recognizes they need our knowledge. They need the expertise that we're able to bring into the sort of understanding of how inclusion works for our kids. I try to be a good partner, but that's a reciprocal relationship. And often families don't feel respected. We don't feel we have an authentic voice at the table, and we need more mutual respect, and we need open communication. We just had an incident with school that had they called me and told me what was going on, I would have gone along with it. I wouldn't have had a problem. But I found out at the last minute that a course change had happened, and it became a crisis and a scramble. Had there been effective communication, it would have been a way easier process for both of us, both partners, school and for us. Having knowledge and information is the other one that's really important. And I think we struggle as families. Figuring out supports shouldn't be this hard. We shouldn't have to feel like you need to know some secret handshake or that there's a hidden door somewhere that magically unlocks all these supports that everyone has said are not available. So I find even though I have a lot of knowledge and information, I know the inclusive education policy inside out and backwards, and I can challenge a principal when they tell me that your kids are tier 3 and we don't do that here. I can remind them that that's not what the policy says, that we in fact tier supports, not children. And even with that, that level of knowledge, we continue to struggle. As of this year, I now have 2 kids in high school, and I have to say that's been a real game changer for me and has probably introduced one of the hardest strategies I've had to swallow, which is learning to pick your battles. Certainly, I find at the high school level, there is less collaboration time built in for teachers. There is more reliance on learning centers as a really baked in model of how people are working. And breaking through that has honestly made me feel like I am banging my head against a wall. It has made it very difficult to establish good relationships because I am an irritant to the system all the time. So I am working on when to pick my battles and having to really focus in on, okay, what is my priority here? And how do I get that need met? How do we make sure the essential piece I need for my kid is being met? And what are the pieces that I can let go? And how do I do that? And that's where I come back to the strength of that vision and that commitment to a vision for inclusion, because that's my guiding light. It gives me my direction when things are going sideways. It reminds me what I need to get back to if at times I've had to step off that path, if I've had to accept that the Learning Center is going to be part of my kids' learning experiences, despite them not wanting that. How do I continue to build those partnerships to get back into a vision for true inclusion? So we know that navigating systems that are outdated and extremely rigid can feel impossible, but we also have wins and we have each other. Being connected to other families or connected to groups like Inclusion Nova Scotia reminds me that I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who's doing these struggles or who has this vision for what inclusion can really look like. And it reminds me that there are supports available, that Inclusion Nova Scotia can come to a meeting with me. They can help advocate for me. They can help navigate systems for me. So I stand by my core strategies of relationships, collaboration, knowledge, and information. Yet I also make sure I know who's who, from our family of schools up to the Regional Center for Education and through to the Department of Education. I know who I can reach out to, and I know who I need to call. If you don't already know that information, I highly encourage you to find out who your student services support people are, who the specialists in your family of schools are, and who your supervisor of supervisors is. Now, I can do a whole other presentation on what it's like to be vilified and identified as the problem parent and how hard it is to escalate challenges. But I also know that if we don't hold the system accountable, no one else is going to either. And truthfully, our kids are the canaries in the coal mine. If education isn't working for our kids, it's because education isn't working. So how are we helping to hold the system to account? Because our schools need more support, our teachers need more support, our EPAs need better support and better pay to be able to advance this. And our voice is critical, not just in securing inclusive education for our family member, but for making sure that for all kids in our family of schools, in our communities, and in our province, also get to have that opportunity for inclusive education, and that we can help make the whole system better for all students in it. So that was kind of my quick and dirty overview. Thank you for listening and for your time, and I look forward to our discussions tonight.
Thanks, Anna. We do have one question in the chat, which I will get to. And just a reminder, if anyone else does have any questions or comments that they've heard from Gordon or Anna, please put that in the Q&A section, and then we'll be able to bring them forward in our discussion. And both of you kind of talked about the state of inclusive education, and obviously, Anna, with your personal experience. Just before we start, for families who are feeling discouraged by the systemic barriers, what are some practical steps that they can take to ensure their child has their rights to inclusion is upheld?
Did you direct that to me?
Either or, whoever wants to take it.
I mean, I
I'll
think
lay it on you right now. So
for me, it is those strategies of, how are we building relationships? How are we building those partnerships? And when those systemic barriers continue to pop up, and again, from the work that I've done across our province, like some people have the same principle from primary through to grade 12, and they'll talk about having this, you have a principle for life. That's where the strategies of getting into your student service support people, into your supervisor of supervisors, we need to ensure that the Center for Education and the Department of Education are working and supporting the schools to be doing the job that they should be doing. And honestly, people's heads explode, I'm sure, when I copy everybody under the sun on the emails that I send out about certain complaints. But that's where I think we have to start, is what supports can the Center of Education bring to bear in a school environment to better support the situation at hand.
right.
Yeah, my take on that is that the most critical issue is that too many people in the system see inclusion as only being about children who are challenging, who are difficult, who are, have parents like Anna that occasionally cause them grief by questioning what they're doing, how they're doing it, what effect it has. And that's a fundamental mistake, I think. And it's something we need to challenge people in the education system to understand that this movement to inclusive education is not just about children with disabilities. It's a broad kind of philosophical change, just to accept the basic premise that all of our children in Canada in 2025 deserve to go to school with their peers, be in the class with their peers, and to have the best opportunity to learn in ways appropriate to them that are possible. And in order for that to happen, people like principals can't see inclusion as, a little project that they manage off the side of their desks. They have their core responsibilities to operate their school and ensure student learning and make sure literacy and math scores are good and behavior is appropriate. And then after they do all that, there's this little problem of inclusion. these kids who are included, as if they're a special kind of child. And it's not seen as part of the core of what they do. And I think the alternative vision is that inclusion is about supporting teachers so they can meet the needs of all of our children. And that's a fundamental difference. It's not about disability. It's not about any kind of special circumstance or any kind of special challenge that a child brings to school. It's about schools being effective and having the practices that let them be successful for everyone. A colleague and I did a report in New Brunswick a few years ago, and the title we selected for our report was Strengthening Inclusion, Strengthening Schools. Because I believe fundamentally that every single investment that a school system puts into supporting teachers so they can handle inclusion effectively means that teacher's a more effective, competent, able teacher for all the children in their class. And when you have a good support system, it doesn't just direct the assistance to children who have traditionally been known as having special needs, or whatever language you want to use for it. Other children in that class probably have struggles as well. And when you support teachers to be able to identify and accommodate, depending on the child's needs, you're supporting all of the children in the class, not just those who are seen as being included. Now, so we need to do away with this. It'd be nice if we could just drop the concept of inclusion, accept that children are part of their peer group in their community school, and that the duty of school leaders, ministers of education, parents, and others is to support teachers so that children can be effectively supported. And it shouldn't be a secondary consideration, which in far too many cases it is. And of course, that means you have to do professional learning for teachers. When something comes up that a teacher's not able to handle, doesn't know quite what to do, immediately there needs to be support, whether it's on an individual basis or if it's something that's more broadly systemic. Maybe it's a collective group of teachers who are given access, training, or professional learning. So that kind of system, I think, will really, really energize our communities and will certainly lead to more success. Parents of children with special needs or disabilities should not have to struggle the way they do now in Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada to get the basics of education that parents should take for granted. And it's time we really provided the leadership to see that changes.
One other thing I would add, Vivian, I know there's more questions, but one other thing I would add is here in Nova Scotia, we also have the Human Rights Remedy. If people aren't familiar with that, there's lots of information available through Inclusion Nova Scotia. And while education is outside the scope specifically of the remedy, there is a piece in the remedy that recognizes people who are leaving school, people who are graduating from high school, need to have an inclusive plan. So I think when we look at what do we as families have in our toolboxes, the remedy is something to hold on to. And when we're having those conversations, so one of the fights I'm having right now is about trying to set up like a co-op or a work placement or even a volunteer placement opportunity. And my school has never done that for a kid with disability before, ever. They have no idea how to pull it off. I've never done it either. So I keep trying to say, let's figure it out together. And here is how it's your responsibility, because part of the remedy is making sure that when my kid graduates from high school, she is not being sheltered or shepherded into a sheltered workshop and a sort of sheltered life. So there is also the use of the remedy to help us build some of those opportunities.
No, I think that's great. And actually, there's a couple of other questions that kind of segue into some of the things that you guys have touched upon already. I'll go with this one first. What do you say to families of non-disabled children who say that having a child with a disability in their classroom detracts from their own child's access to education?
Yeah. So I'm that family, by the way. My kiddos are the porcupines in your classrooms. When they aren't supported, it can be challenging in very public facing kind of ways. When my eldest was in grade 5, I had caught, there was a situation and I kind of got stuck against a certain part of the playground, and I couldn't leave because she would see me and it would make the situation worse. And I was sort of stuck where I was. And I watched 2 moms on that playground imitate and make fun of my kid. I am constantly the family who is, sort of being the one who's disrupting classes. And what I try to say and try and explain all the time is that the disruption is happening because the kids aren't being supported. And we know that this gets back to proper supports, individualized supports. We do a lot of these cookie cutter supports and expect that, well, this worked for that kid, so surely it's going to work for this kid because that's the only thing we know in our toolbox. So I think the biggest piece and the biggest message I have for families who see this as a disruption is what you're witnessing is not inclusive education. It is a lack of support, and we need their help to advocate for better school supports. We need their help to advocate for their kids to be more inclusive as well. Of how are we helping peers? Gordon said this at the beginning, kids are the #1 supporter of inclusive education. And that has been very true at many parts in our life. And it is often, especially when they were little, it was the young kids who could be like, telling their own parent, oh, mom, don't pay attention to that. We just need to give her a minute, then it's going to be fine. And the mom would be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that part. So I think that it is a message of a lack of support, not anything about an individual. And it certainly should never be interpreted that kid should not be in that school.
A couple other things people often say is that inclusion results in holding other kids back. And anecdotally, maybe that occurs from time to time, but in terms of the research, it's very clear, and there was some major research done a few years ago in British Columbia about this, that the schools that have more inclusion do not have lower academic outcomes for students than schools that don't have any inclusion at all, that there is no negative effect of having an inclusive school. And I would argue that if properly operated, in fact, like I said earlier, inclusion can help raise the standards and the teaching competence of people in the school. The other thing is that inclusion means the children who are, quote, included take up all the teacher's time. And again, that's not the way classrooms work. If I have a class of 25 students, I don't divide my 50-minute instructional time for each of them. And, each child gets 2 minutes of time. Children who present with challenges that teachers have to work on don't necessarily take a whole lot of extra time. And in many cases, in a lot of cases, there are educational assistants who are there to provide assistance with that kind of challenge. So I think that these myths of the negative effects of inclusion are a bit overplayed. Now, mind you, when there isn't the proper support, when teachers don't have the support they need, if the school doesn't have a culture of inclusion, if the school leaders are waffling about whether this is a good idea or it isn't, if they're not particularly good at figuring out what kind of help teachers and students need, then things can certainly go very badly. But when people do a really good job, when they're properly supported, we've seen time and time again in many, many schools that inclusion can not only be positive, but can have better outcomes than not being inclusive.
No, that's great. Just going on with the next question, and maybe I'll put this towards you, Anna, because you might be the one that can answer it. What's the difference between tier 3 compared to tier 2 or tier 1?
Gordon can probably answer better than I can. I can just complain about it. So from
Yeah,
my,
I'm happy to do that. And I was in Nova Scotia when that was a major topic of the discussion, and probably it still is. But what Anna suggested a minute ago when she talked about this is exactly the danger that these kind of formulas or ways of constructing approaches to teaching, the dangers that they present. It's a basically good idea, the tier idea. The concept is that teachers do their teaching, and then there are a number of things teachers can do that make accommodations, different ways to present information and learning, different ways to measure it. And tier 3, if that's the base of the pyramid, means that you do a lot of things that'll benefit almost all students in order to learn better within that third tier. So that's accommodations and variations of teaching and approaches to learning that accommodate everyone in the class. And then that there are some students who need more defined accommodations, perhaps in one area or another, and maybe during specific times, but not all the time. And that's the concept of tier 2, more specialized, and again, it's accommodations in the classroom to help them have as much success as possible. And tier 1 is theoretically, I'm going to tier 1, are students who need quite significant extra planning in order to meet their needs. It doesn't mean you call them tier 1 students, but the concept is that teachers need to think very clearly about what they do and how they do it with a certain number of kids, but it's not very many. So that's the concept, and presented and operated appropriately, it's not a problem. The problem is, like Anna just said, the natural inclination of teachers is to say, you're a tier 3 kid, you're a tier 2 kid, and you're a tier 1 student. And to categorize children on that basis, that is not good. I think it's arguable that the construct as a whole presents just as much harm as help. And that isn't the way the people that came up with it in the first place intended. So it's really a dilemma about what to do with that and many other well-intentioned ideas. When they're not properly implemented, when they're not properly thought out and directed towards the goal that they're supposed to be meeting or achieving, then you get these side effects, these unintended consequences. And the tiers of support is not a bad concept. But when you say that it's categorizing children into tiers, and then everybody talks about them as if, well, he's a tier 3 student, or, well, no, they're going to say that about tier 1. But it's,
I think it is the other way around. Like, I think for us,
well, whatever way the pyramid works, yeah. In different places, they've actually used different terms.
Yeah.
But it's bottom, middle, and top. And at the top of the pyramid are the kids with the greatest needs.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple questions coming in around shortages and strike. So I'll just read the first one here. Currently worried about the looming strike that will see many support workers potentially walking off the job. And I was wondering if you have any insights or help on how we as parents can fight this and what our rights are.
Great question, and one I struggled with a lot. So when it happened here in Halifax last year, the year before, the overwhelming feedback I got from schools was, we'll keep your kids as long as we can, and then we won't. And it was things like, I got a call one day and there was a field trip, and they said, your middle daughter can't go on the field trip. We don't have an EPA. And I said, well, that sounds like a staffing issue, not an EPA issue. And if you don't have enough staff for the whole group to go, the group can't go. And that made me, again, very unpopular. And unpopular with other parents as well, and suggesting the response to inadequate staffing due to the strike is that you need to have adequate staffing. And if you can't do that, you can't just ask one group of kids to stay home. So theoretically, schools are not supposed to be allowed to do this. We all know as families that they do it no matter what. You can report it to the Department of Education and request support from them to make sure that this isn't happening. But certainly in Halifax, when it happened that last time, 600 kids were told to stay home.
There's no easy answer to that problem. I mean, I think having educational assistants and teachers in a different union, I mean, as a matter of principle, we allow workers to be in unions. Unions negotiate with governments, and occasionally they get into these disputes. But children should not suffer as a consequence. And the remedy, of course, is to maintain good relationships with employee groups, make sure they're paid reasonable wages, and make sure their working conditions are effective, and make sure they're trained. Like many people say, well, educational assistants, what do you call them? Educational
EPA's program assistants, yeah.
Right, in Nova Scotia. That you know, that they're assaulted and they live very dangerous working lives, and to some degree that may happen on occasion, but you know, the fact is that I think most workers go to school every day wanting to do a good job with the children, and it's up to our politicians and our educational leaders to see that the system works for everybody. It's simply not acceptable to have kids with special needs simply denied the right to go to school while governments try to work out collective agreements with unions. But the answer, who knows?
And it reinforces for me the challenge of, again, this notion that inclusion lies solely in the responsibility of EPAs. They have a critical part of it, absolutely, and they are, you know, integral to the process. But we also need to be shifting our mindsets into what does inclusion more broadly look like, and how are we tapping into resources already in the school? And to Gordon's point that he had made earlier about what are the supports that can be brought to bear into the classroom setting, so that we're not just sort of grouping kids out or lumping somebody out. So I think it does require advocacy on our part. I think we need to be calling on our government to be doing a better job for supporting EPAs. I think we need to call on our schools to do a better job at why we are so over-reliant on one sole source of support for students in school, and that's problematic. And then I think we need to be reporting any and all schools that are sending our kids home or refusing to allow them to be part of things like field trips, because that's a staffing shortage issue. And if you don't have enough staff to safely run your school, you're going to need to shut the school down for everyone, not just for us.
Yeah, and I just took part in a preparation for Monday night. We're having or Monday afternoon, evening, we're having a webinar on the issue of partial day school attendance that's being used by schools increasingly across Canada as a solution to dealing with children that they don't know quite what to do with. And, you know, I think Anna's talked about that a little bit. We did a survey, and we're going to be going over the results and having a panel on that topic. But I guess what I want to say here is that this lack of accommodation and support happens when everybody is working, not just when educational assistants or education program assistants are on strike, but they're actually sending children home or calling the parent to take them home at any moment that the school thinks is necessary, or requiring them to only come to school an hour or not 2 hours a day. These things are happening even when all the teachers are working and all the EAs are working, and we still have this kind of lack of support and really abandoning the commitment that every child should be at school all day, every day. And it's very revealing the importance that is put on these children going to school.
Yeah. And it's a slippery slope. Like we certainly found, so my youngest got put on partial attendance, and it had happened. We ended up having to, it was one of my decisions to scorch the earth moments. So we ended up moving schools at one point of his career, and getting back into school, it had been a really traumatic thing. So we agreed we needed sort of an ease in kind of start to get him back to school. He had refused to go for about a couple of months at that point in time. So we knew as a team, yeah, okay, that makes sense as we transition back to being a full-time learner. And it never happened. Every single term, there was some excuse or some reason or something. Well, you know, we're just not ready yet. We're just not there yet. And it just kept pushing back and pushing back. And then for us, it then pushed into COVID. So he ended up missing almost like over a year of school, and lost his sense of identity as a learner, lost his sense of connection to his school. And we have never been able to recover from that. So I think often schools will try and pitch it to families as well as like, oh, it's this temporary measure and let's figure this out together. And then you end up in a place you really didn't intend to be.
Adrian, I really think, like, I want to kind of turn the script here a little. There are all kinds of challenges and difficulties to make inclusion work really, really well in our schools. But let's not lose focus on the fact that today, most children, particularly in Atlantic Canada or the Maritimes, and to some degree across the country, the presumption that they'll go to their local school and be in a class with peers is still pretty strong. And it's significantly greater than it was when I started down this path. And I think we can't lose sight of that. Most teachers believe in inclusion. In fact, surveys show that teachers very strongly support inclusion. And their unions usually they support it as well, but they usually have sort of conditions that they apply, or, you know, things that, well, as long as there's enough training or enough support. And those are all legitimate too. But inclusion should not be available only when ideal circumstances are in place. It should be available to children, whatever the reality of an individual school or classroom. And then, like with all children, it's up to the leaders of our school system to try to make sure they're effective for everybody. But let's not be too, like, let's reiterate that inclusion is worth it, that in most cases, teachers will embrace it, that school leaders can meet the challenge. And I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of them who have. It's possible. It's happening in our country. It's happening in Nova Scotia. And we need not, while we identify the problems, we can't forget the positive progress that's been made from having children's institutions and special schools. And that's not so far in the past. So we've made progress. And I think we need to celebrate that progress while continuing to work on ways that we can improve how things are done and how they meet every child's needs. And so I just want to make sure that we reiterate that. It's easy to deconstruct the problems, and there are lots of them, but we need to emphasize the positive outcomes that we've achieved in our provinces and our communities, and extend it to those that are struggling a little more. One of the strategies that I found most useful when I was doing some work on this in one province was to set up collaborations among schools. Like if you had 3 schools, all of whom had similar demographics, and one of them may be really good in inclusion and another so-so and another not so good, bring those people together, have them share ideas. And when we did that, the schools that had more to do really receptive to the examples provided by schools that were more successful. So I think we have to be positive in our approach to both the professionals in our schools and the children. And again, remember that the strongest element in producing successful inclusion are all the other children who provide the support to those who need it. And we need to remember that.
Thanks, Gordon. Just going on to the next question, I think you both kind of touched on this about shifting the focus of inclusion away solely from just EPAs. But with the shortage of EPAs making authentic inclusion even more challenging, do we know if there's any efforts at the provincial level to address the shortage? Not sure if we have an answer for that, but.
I mean, I don't, Vivian or Jana, I would defer to you from your conversations. Certainly there's been commitments to hire more people. There's under the inclusive education policy to hire more staff. And there were a few announcements along those lines, sort of 2020-ish, but I'm not sure.
And I think I would say, like, going back to what you kind of said is like, we really need to do the focus has to be on training all staff to look at how do we support all students and ensure inclusion rather than the emphasis on EPA. So kind of providing more capacity within the system rather than one profession.
Yeah.
Some of these questions, I'm just, what are some ongoing professional development opportunities existing for educators around equity and inclusion? Are they easily accessible? I think this is a great opportunity for Gordon to talk about your work and then the webinar that you're going to be doing on Monday.
Well, first of all, Inclusive Education Canada just developed a new website that we hope people are aware of. It's called Source for Inclusive Education. And it has a number of resources. It's not meant to be, a graduate to replace graduate courses, or it's a very basic introduction to the key principles that go into making inclusive education successful. So that's one thing I would point to. It's called Source for Inclusive Education. I think it's .ca, could be .com, I forget. And the other thing is that, we do have Inclusive Education Canada. And one of the real differences between when I started in this field and today is that all across Canada, my colleagues and I in Inclusion Canada might have been able to identify 4 or 5 university professors who worked in the area of special education who were clearly pro-inclusion. And one of them was at Acadia, by the way. His name was Don Little. But there were very, very few people who were writing and doing research and out of the academic community supporting inclusion. Today, if you look at our inclusive education website, which is being renewed in the next week or so, but you'll see that we have maybe 30 what we call associates. And this is a network of people who work in inclusive education, have experience, and probably 20 or so of them are university professors and researchers. Their main field of interest is inclusion, and they work to do research and teaching about inclusive education. And that's a significant, and they're not the only ones. There are others that aren't in our network. So there are an incredible number of people who are knowledgeable and capable to help people think through and improve inclusive education practices in this country. And we need to use them. In Nova Scotia, you have them, and be happy to talk to you about how you might be able to contact or make use of some of them. So it's a positive story. We're making progress. lots of challenges ahead, but you know, we have made progress in this country.
And if I could add to that, I think certainly as a family member, we are seeing the result of that. So I think more educators are going through an education program that has elements of inclusive teaching to it. And it's things like differentiated curriculum instead of special curriculum. And so I'm starting to see in some of the younger teachers who are coming through, or newer teachers who are coming through, a very different lens from the outset on what inclusive education could be. And that, I will say, that absolutely inspires me and gives me hope. And there is, as Gordon was saying, and as much as I get frustrated and disappointed in our system sometime, there has always been a teacher, someone somewhere who has wanted really, really badly to make this work and have been essential in our journeys and have been remarkable. So there are those key pieces of success, and holding on to those. And I always talk about like putting them in my emotional piggy bank for the days that don't go as well as I would like. I can rely on the fact that there are some key allies who are out there who are fighting just as hard as we are. And how do we scale that up and connect all of them is an important piece.
I just have a couple of questions around, so I'll read this one directly. In schools with limited resources, how can we balance providing support for students with special needs while ensuring that teachers and other students are not overwhelmed? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, schools, I don't know what the perception is about schools that aren't resourced. Like in most Canadian provinces, and I think in Nova Scotia, the allocation of teachers there's a standard formula that's used. So in terms of teachers and principals and other specialists like that, I don't think any school should be able to say that they're shortchanged. In terms of educational assistance, access to people like speech pathologists and so on, that may differ from place to place depending on the availability of people. Like, for example, in many parts of the country, speech language pathologists are in very short supply. In some schools, it may be harder to have somebody who can provide expert assistance with, say, with children who are experiencing autism and the effects of that. But generally, schools are provided. I would be very leery of accepting that schools don't have pretty much equal access to resources. Now, there is one thing that I would say, is that there are communities that have a much higher proportion maybe of children who live in less, with less economic income of the people in that community, with some of the social effects that result from those kind of factors. And in many places, in some countries particularly, the formula is amended. If you have a higher percentage of kids who are considered at risk, then access to further resources is provided. So those are the kind of strategies that can be used, but I don't think a school can get off the hook from not providing good quality education by saying we don't have the resources.
And I guess just a quick follow-up to that one is, what would you say to people who say the type of inclusive education that you're describing is too expensive?
Well, it's not too. If you follow the traditional method of specialized segregated education for anybody who has a challenge, that is very expensive. When you take a child out of the regular class and do something special, it costs money. And I think that every time a child goes to a resource room for a day or a half day, you have to understand that they're probably working there with a teacher in a group of 6 or 8, or, it differs from place to place, so you can't generalize. But generally speaking, When the child leaves the regular class, not only does the child leave, but money goes with them. So if you want to really make the best use of the money available to support education in general, you keep the children in and you push all the resources you have into supporting the class to be effective. And different community, like in our provinces generally, the provincial government provides all the money for education. You know, there are many parts of the world, our neighbor, the United States, where local taxes make up a significant portion of the education budget. That's not the case in Nova Scotia. The money comes directly from the provincial government. It goes to a regional organization. In some provinces, they're called school districts. Yours aren't called that anymore. But they get the resources, and then they equitably share them out. And if it's not equitable, then I'm sure parents are going to let them know. So there's no excuse to say that one school has more than another. But it doesn't cost more money if you push the resources in. When I worked directly in a school system, I worked with what we called resource teachers, and we had 2 or 3 of them in every school. And when I met with them to talk about their mandate, I was very clear. Your job, you don't teach children hour by hour in a classroom. You don't teach a class. You're there to support inclusion as we define it now. And their job is to help teachers be successful. So my injunction was, today at 10 o'clock, which teacher were you helping be successful? Now, obviously, that's not quite how it works, but all of the people employed in the education system, from the leaders to the principals, to the resource teachers, to the guidance counselors, the social workers, the speech therapists, the educational assistants, all of those people have one reason to be paid out of public taxes, and that's to help classroom teachers be successful, to have as much success as possible with the children in their class. And it's up to the people who lead the system to use those resources most effectively, to see that people who fill those positions have the experience, training, and competence to be able to help people with even their most difficult challenges.
Yeah.
And that's another critical thing we could talk about for an hour. Are we sure that the people providing the help are experienced, competent people who can actually deliver help to a teacher who isn't sure what to do, but's willing if they're provided with the right support?
Yeah. And I would just add to that, I think part of the idea that this is expensive or my school doesn't have resources, we've created this idea of inclusion as a service, right? So if I don't have a learning center in my school, we're under-resourced. If I don't have a specialist of X, Y, or Z in my school, we're under-resourced. And I think it is, you know, how do we better look at our system as a whole and the resources in the system? And similarly to Gordon's piece on whether or not it's more expensive, the school level is usually where that argument initially comes from. Well, we don't have an allocation for another EPA. We can't afford this, this, or this. And the response to that is that legally, it is the responsibility of the province of Nova Scotia. So the school may, in fact, not have the money to hire whoever. They may, in fact, not have the money to get, you know, my gang uses a lot of like sensory-based equipment, especially when they were little. They maybe couldn't have afforded those sorts of things in all of the classrooms. That doesn't have to stop with them. The responsibility is that it cannot provide an undue burden or undue hardship on the province. So it is that piece of having to fight and fight and fight. But if your school can't do it, can the Center of Education do it? If they can't do it, what's the province doing to support them? The other piece I always like to remind people in my meetings over is that the cost, as Gordon said, goes with the kid. The cost of crisis is ludicrous. So we've had a number of crises along the way. And all of a sudden I'm sitting in a meeting with 20 people having resources thrown at us that had been denied for weeks or months on end. if we were to better use the resources we have, if we better allocated those from the get-go, we would be in a better position. But we are crisis driven, we are reactive, and that does cost a ton of money. If we could be more proactive and systemic, it could be a better system.
And just being cognizant of time, I'm going to close off with this question because I think it's a great segue. How do we as parents ensure that admin and educators are treating our children fairly? And if they aren't, what recourse do we have, or how can we hold them accountable?
Well, obviously, the starting point, if it's a teacher or someone in the classroom, is to engage with the school principal and try to resolve the issue. But parents have a right to expect their child to be treated with respect, to be dealt with fairly, and it shouldn't be a problem. Obviously, when cases occur when that's not the case, then you have to go to more extreme steps. But my experience as an educator myself is that most of the time people want to solve problems in an equitable and fair way. And I think that's the presumption you should have. And if that's not the case, and there are many examples of when there's not the case, then you use the system, go step by step till you get somebody who's responsible and hold them accountable. Accountability, unfortunately, isn't what it should be in our education system. The Ministry of Education in most provinces where they have school districts, now a little different in Nova Scotia now, where these regional directors, I think, are report directly. I'm not sure. Do they report directly to the education ministry, or I'm not sure.
Necessarily a direct report. There's a lot of autonomy.
Yeah. Well, in most provinces, the superintendent reports to the school board, and then the ministry has to engage with the school board, and they're very reluctant to tell those folks what to do. They allow tremendous flexibility, and some would say no accountability for fulfilling what even the laws of the province or the policies of the minister are. And I think it's up to citizens, parents, to demand accountability, and that things that are important be measured. Like this whole question of partial day school attendance. In many parts of the country, nobody has any.
I think Gordon froze.
Yeah.
There are in Nova Scotia, I'm guessing 400 or so. But whatever number it is, somebody should know that there are 6 children in this school who only go to school part-time, but down the road 30 miles, there's a school that's similar, but they have everybody in school all day. And when you see these kind of numbers, you can hold people accountable. You can go to the school that's not doing as well and saying, can you explain why this is happening? So accountability and the courage for political leaders and for administrative leaders to hold people accountable is a serious, serious issue that's not really, I don't think, functioning the way it should be. And it's up to us to try to change it.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, Diana? Or?
No, I agree with that. And I think as a parent, finding that accountability is often, I'm left with disappointment. We've had a number of situations where our kids have not even been treated nicely, let alone equitably or fairly. And the system is, it sometimes feels designed to protect its own. And so for me, it continues to get back to, okay, so where are we building the relationship? How are we doing that? Because all of it works better when there are good relationships in place, for sure. And when we can have that sort of common understanding. Some of my best experiences have been like my youngest, who was a disaster, and the COVID kid who didn't get back to school. His junior high principal was amazing and fundamentally changed a whole bunch of pieces and invested in our relationship, would call me on like everything, and not in negative ways, but we just had a more open process. So if things weren't going well, or if there was a bad day, I knew we could call and figure it out. So I think in some ways, almost proactively avoiding anything you have to be held accountable for starts with really good relationships. And it makes a huge difference when there are positive relationships in place, and with people who can see your kids in positive lights and can see your kid. I always say to our teachers or our support people, my kid's not giving you a hard time. My kid's having a hard time, and just helping shift their mindset of, I think that sometimes behavior gets seen with all this intentionality. And so people start to get really defensive and judgmental about that, and helping people get out of that really changes how they see my kids.
Vivian, I'd like to ask you to indulge me. I've noted that one of our attendees tonight is someone that I've known for quite a few years. And just to show the reach of this kind of endeavor, her name is Filomena Pereira. She's a longtime head of inclusive education in Portugal. And I see her name on the line here, and I want to offer a friendly greeting from Canada to Filomena. Glad to see you join us.
Welcome. And I was just gonna say is if you are a family member who is navigating those conversations and would like support, reach out to Inclusion Nova Scotia, because we can be that relationship that you can help to build within the schools, and then help with the escalation process if need be as well. So with that, I just want to thank you both. But before we end today, as Gordon did mention, there is some things to celebrate within our education system, and we have made immense strides. And this year we created the Inclusive Education Award to recognize some of the work that's being done. So we put out a call to nomination from the community, and we had an overwhelming response. And so the first ever inaugural award is actually going to be awarded to 2 people because of that. So I would like to congratulate our winners today, Sarah McDaniel, who is a dedicated teacher, advocate, and leader in our school community in Cape Breton Highlands Academy, committed to inclusion and accessibility for students and families with disabilities. Through Sarah's work in the classroom and advocating for supportive equipment, she helped break down barriers and create more inclusive learning environment. She's also the founder of a strong family network called Devoted to Diversity, where she has fostered a sense of community and family advocates that prioritize inclusion, and has inspired other community family networks in the province. So congratulations, Sarah. Also like to congratulate Brandy Jarvis, who is the Mi'kma'ki student coordinator with the Tri-County Regional Center for Education. Brandy goes above and beyond to create meaningful opportunities for connection, collaboration, and understanding among students, teachers, and families. Brandy actively promotes inclusivity through initiatives such as the Inclusive Education and accessible extracurricular activities, transforming school culture. Brandy's leadership empowers parents, staff, students to embrace diversity and a welcoming and equitable community. So I want to say congratulations to both of you. I believe you are on here. So if people want to give them shout outs or congrats, you feel free to do so in the chat. And we will be getting your prizes out to you shortly. We will be highlighting some of the other submissions that were submitted for this award. Once again, we want to say we had an astounding, overwhelming response to it. So just acknowledging that there are great people doing great work across the province on behalf of inclusive education. And we hope to continue this. So if there is other people that you want to nominate in the future, we encourage you to do so as well. Before we sign off, I want to thank Gordon and Anna for their insights. Thank you for sharing us. Thank you for joining us and sharing your journeys through promoting inclusive education. And I'd like to say, if you are a family and wants to continue this journey of advocating for inclusion, we encourage you to connect with us at Inclusion Nova Scotia. We have staff across the province, and along with events like the ones that were mentioned, we have a team that's ready to help navigate and connect you to the supports and resources that you need. And also, as Gordon is here, I can't leave without saying a shout out to Source for Inclusive Education and Inclusive Education Canada. It's a valuable resource for families with information, best practices, and advocacies on national scale. So please feel free to check that out. The link is in the chat box as well. So thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.